Tengo que decir que verdaderamente para mí es un honor que me emociona presentar a Holton, porque ha sido uno de mis héroes. Entiendo que cualquier presentación, por ponderada que fuese, de este, y luego explicaré por qué, gigante de la cultura moderna, puede parecer excesiva o hiperbólica, incluso laudatoria, flattering, but it is not. It's like exactly what we feel. Es, como me decía Herschbach, un gigante que se apoya en los dos pilares del humanismo moderno, la ciencia y las letras. Una gran figura intelectual con espléndida finura, admirable erudición y un escritor excepcional. Abandonó Austria de joven, de adolescente, en 1938, cuando los nazis de Austria ponían en peligro muchas cosas. Gran Bretaña sacó a 10.000 personas de Austria y hubo una lotería para ver quién salía. Él salió junto con su hermano. Incidentalmente, como él escribe, otro de los que salió era un católico ferviente, premio Nobel de Física en 1936 por los rayos cósmicos, Victor Hess, y que estaba en serio peligro y salió junto con aquellos jóvenes, incluso confiscaron hasta su fortuna. Es un símbolo. Luego 2.000 de esos niños, de esos jóvenes, acabaron en los Estados Unidos. Es un símbolo para todos de la defensa de la racionalidad científica, de la defensa de la cultura científica frente a los ataques de la irracionalidad, de diversos tipos de irracionalidad. Holton se ha ocupado de muchas cosas, pero se ha ocupado de dos dimensiones de la cultura científica y, en particular, lo que nos toca hoy a nosotros, de la cultura científica en y alrededor de la obra de Albert Einstein. Por un lado, la contribución de Einstein o la influencia de la contribución de Einstein a la cultura general de nuestro tiempo. En trabajos como La influencia de Einstein en la cultura de nuestro tiempo o Einstein y el objetivo de la ciencia. Pero también la influencia de Einstein en la cultura de la ciencia en sí misma. No la cultura de la sociedad en general, sino la cultura propia de la selva o de la comunidad científica, en 6 trabajos maravillosos, incluidos en el avance de la ciencia y sus problemas, entre ellos el modelo de Einstein para construir una teoría científica. Es un excelente profesor y escritor de libros, le preocupa la docencia y transmite en sus excelentes libros de física también una misión global de historia y de otros aspectos. Vive en Harvard, en la casa de Sert, el gran arquitecto Sert, incidentalmente es el tío del Sert, cuyas pinturas podemos ver aquí cerca, a menos de 100 metros en el museo. Para Holton, la ciencia es fundamentalmente para una aventura humana, a human adventure. Le admiramos por cómo ha sabido transmitirlo y para mí es un placer darle la palabra al profesor de física y también de historia de la ciencia de la Universidad de Harvard. Welcome, sir.
Dear Sir, Professor Echenique, I cannot thank you enough for your very kind introduction, for having invited us to be guests at that beautiful city in this lovely country with unmatched hospitality. Now, we have been celebrating the great successes of Einstein in this conference and indeed around the world. And the most exciting aspect for a historian of science of Einstein's work is that it promised the first grand unification of physical theories since the days of Maxwell. Einstein's 1905 paper brought together under one roof electricity, magnetism, much of mechanics, thermodynamics, space and time, energy and inertia. He once confessed he was obsessed with a mindset that can be called Ionian enchantment because it is analogous to the quest of the ancient Greek philosophers, such as Thales, on the islands of the Ionian Sea, who hoped to find, under all the infinity of different events, some great unification, some simple answer to the questions that arises. And to this day, many scientists follow in the path parallel to that of Einstein. In a way, he has given the program to many scientists of our day. But the historian of science cannot overlook, even during the celebrations of his great successes, that there was, and there indeed remains, another side to the story, which is also an important part of intellectual history. Einstein's triumphs did not come easily. For Einstein and for his point of view, there were serious opponents, there were real enemies, and we must not forget that. That is why the proper title of my talk might be Einstein, Relativity, Relativism, and Their Opponents. But let me start with a vignette, with a happy event in Einstein's life. On the 23rd of February 1923, Albert Einstein and his wife arrived in Barcelona. He was then at the height of his fame throughout much of the world, not only for his science, but also for his stand against war, against militarism. His arrival in Spain near the end of a 6-month-long worldwide tour was the result of 3 years of negotiations to have him come to Spain. It was spearheaded by the mathematician and physicist Esteve Terradas and by the mathematician Julio Rey Pastor. Einstein came to lecture for 2 weeks. He spent it in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Toledo, in Zaragoza. And he spoke chiefly on special and general relativity. And everywhere, his lectures and his presence were greeted by almost worshipful academics and by large, excited crowds. As a biographer noted, the German ambassador reported home, without exaggeration, that never in human memory has a foreign scholar met with such an enthusiastic and extraordinary reception in Spain. Einstein, in turn, was overwhelmed by the beauty of the country. For example, an entry in his diary reads, when he was in Toledo, "It is one of the most beautiful days of my life." But on the day of his arrival in Catalonia, there also happened, according to many sources, 2 small incidents. One of them I shall describe at the end. The other throws some light on the question how Einstein regarded himself, who he thought he was. According to Thomas Glick's account in his book, Einstein in Spain, Einstein and his wife managed to arrive at the train station in Barcelona without encountering the big party which had come to greet them. So Einstein proceeded to a humble pension down the street, and when the proprietor of the enterprise learned from the newspapers the identity of his guests, he went to Einstein's room and found the physicist seated on the bed playing his violin. To the municipal functionary who also came, Einstein explained I am here a modest citizen. I chose a room which corresponds to my category. But the hotelier insisted that Einstein go to the Ritz Hotel as had been planned for him. The outstanding Spanish scientists were, of course, well acquainted with his work. They participated in the enthusiastic reception of his presentation. But there also was a small group that remained skeptical about relativity theory. The leading Spanish anti-relativist was the astronomer Josep Comasola, who favored an alternate theory, a Newtonian emission theory, despite the objection from his colleagues. The great variety of antagonists of Einstein and of relativity theory and of its consequences are here going to be mentioned, but only indicated at this point. In fact, during Einstein's visit to Madrid, the Spanish Minister of Education offered Einstein a home in Spain to stay there in the name of the Spanish nation. He said that Einstein should move to Spain if Einstein found that conditions in Germany would impede the tranquil continuation of his intellectual studies. Why was the Minister of Education saying this? He was referring, of course, to the fact that Einstein had come to Spain as a refugee. He was a refugee from violent opponents back in Berlin. He had left Berlin in October of 1922. He had made a round-the-world tour, essentially to flee from the threat of his political enemies, and accepted long-standing invitations from China, Japan, Palestine, and Spain. Because one must not forget that the Nazi rowdies in Germany, already in those early years, the early 1920s, were commanding the streets in Berlin and many other cities, many years before Hitler was handed the reins of government in 1933. A friend of Einstein, who was Germany's foreign minister, Walter Rathenau, had been assassinated by such a gang in June 1922, and Einstein's name was found to be on the list of future victims. So Einstein canceled his lecture in Berlin. He reported himself officially absent. He embarked on his long journey, saying he was glad to be absent for a prolonged time. Enmity against Einstein in Germany went far beyond that of those street hoodlums and was a strange concoction of perverse racism, perverse politics, and perverse science. Soon after Einstein had assumed his distinguished position in Berlin in 1914, World War I broke out, and Einstein, to dismay of his colleagues, did not hide who he was, a pacifist, an anti-nationalist in favor of European peaceful coexistence, a social democrat, and a Jew. Soon after the war, there arose in Germany the idea, the First War, there arose the idea, supported by a few distinguished scientists, such as Lenard and Stark, the idea that the relativity theory was a form of Jewish science, replete with abstract thinking, with mathematical manipulations, whereas true German science, Deutsche Physik, would be solidly experimental, free of any paradox, based on the sensibility of the folk. This was said to be characteristic of the Nordic race, which Einstein clearly did not belong to. An organization was formed, calling itself the Working Party of German Scientists for the Preservation of Pure Science. And in August 1920, they held their first raucous meeting in the Great Hall of the Philharmonic Society in Berlin, attacking Einstein and his theories. Einstein was so appalled that he even then toyed with the idea of leaving Germany right then and there, the more so as other meetings like this followed. After 1933, of course, this enmity to Einstein and his work became part of government policy. It was declared at the highest level that science must be understandable by ordinary folks, because otherwise it undermined people's instinct of nature. Most German scientists were, of course, appalled by this, but in teaching or in articles, whenever they referred to relativity theory, they had to not mention Einstein, but to mention ideologically more acceptable scientists, such as Lorentz, Poincaré, Hasenöhrl. Even Werner Heisenberg, who continued courageously to use relativity freely in his writings, was personally admonished by Heinrich Himmler, and it took 1 year to get clearance for him. To be sure, politically and ideologically based opposition to relativity theory and to Einstein was also present in the Soviet Union and in China during Mao's regime. But evidence of occasional rebellions against modern science flares up also in the United States. For example, a widely read journalist, John Horgan, prophesied and urged in his book, The End of Science, that the end must and should come soon. And about a month ago, he wrote again, celebrating common sense as the alternative to modern science. The unforgivable sin of relativity theory, he said, was that it shattered one's common sense notions about how the world works. Now I turn to more respectable disbelievers among scientists who struggled with relativity theory. Indeed, it's very ironic that in this year of 2005, the relativity paper of Einstein is being celebrated from Beijing to Jerusalem, from Tenerife to everywhere in civilized places. But in the beginning, in 1905, and for years afterwards, relativity had hardly any believers. Einstein himself resisted naming his work relativity theory, as others were calling it. He referred to it for years as relativity principle. In a later paper, he called it the so-called relativity theory. And only in 1911 did he agree to use the phrase relativity theory in the title of one of his papers. In his correspondence, he was happier with the term Invariantentheorie, which is, of course, much more true to its method and aim, above all, to recast the laws of physics to a form covariant with respect to transformation. How much nonsense would have been spared if Einstein had initially adopted the term invariance instead of relativity. But to a friend who wrote him suggesting such a change in 1921, Einstein replied wearily, "I admit the term relativity theory is unfortunate, has given occasion to philosophical misunderstandings, but I believe it would cause confusion to change the accepted name after all this time." Moreover, in 1905, nobody was waiting for Einstein to redefine physics. There were readily at hand great theories, starting with Maxwell. There were heady experimental breakthroughs, X-rays, radioactivity, the discovery of the electron, the searches for the ether by different individuals and teams. A few saw clouds on the horizon, as we always do, but there was no crisis at hand demanding a revolutionary change of some paradigm. On the contrary, Lorentz's theory of the electron and Poincaré's work along traditional lines were respectable advances, whereas relativity theory, as presented by Einstein, could seem initially as a suspicious gamble involving paradoxes and little that was useful or necessary. The three experiments which he proposed in his 1905 paper couldn't be done at the time. And those experiments that could be done such as Walter Kaufmann of Göttingen, published just a few months after Einstein's paper, announced categorically the experimental disproof of Einstein's relativity theory. It took some time for great Kaufmann's experiment to be shown to be flawed. There was a leak in his vacuum system. But in the meantime, among distinguished physicists, it was only Max Planck who stood up early for relativity in a public meeting in 1906, and he did so frankly on aesthetic grounds. He said, "It is more simpatico." Slowly, slowly, others came around. Wilhelm Wien withdrew his earlier disagreement, not because of any clear-cut evidence from experiment, but because, as he put it, what speaks for Einstein's work most of all is the inner consistency which makes it possible to lay a foundation having no self-contradictions. And similarly, Lorentz agreed that his own approach, compared to Einstein, was clumsy. As time went on, the theory revealed itself to be too beautiful not to be true. But throughout it all, Einstein himself maintained his self-confidence, as he did in his general theory of relativity, even before the 1919 experimental support. Today, the antagonists against relativity theory have shrunk to a small handful. But there is now, and there has been for a long time, a quite different set of disbelievers, not just in relativity, but in relativism. And I now turn to them. The complex responses of theological authority to scientific thought is, of course, well known, starting long before the dispute between Galileo and the clergy. But when Einstein's relativity theory eventually became widely admired, not just by scientists, but to Einstein's own everlasting puzzlement, also by the general public, various theologians became concerned to what extent that theory and its general point of view might infringe on the authority of the Church. This came to Einstein's notice in an unexpected way in June 1921. He was returning to Berlin from his first trip to America. He stopped in England. There, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Church, had been concerned about the possible consequences of relativity for religion. So dutifully, he had been trying to read several books on relativity theory. However, this conscientious man, according to his friend, only was driven into a state of intellectual desperation. So he asked to meet Einstein himself during his stay in London. A dinner was arranged. The Archbishop was placed to sit right next to Einstein and started by asking quite bluntly, what effect does relativity have on religion? Einstein's answer was simple: none. Relativity is a purely scientific matter. It has nothing to do with religion. This assured the theologian, but others were not so easily satisfied. Among them was the prominent Cardinal O'Connell, Archbishop of Boston. In one of his speeches, he put his finger on an old and powerful accusation by some clergy that relativity, like evolution before it, must be rejected because, as Cardinal O'Connell put it, they were mainly materialistic and therefore unable to stand the test of time, unquote. And he added that Einstein's theory was, quote, befogged speculation, producing universal doubt about God and his creation, implying the ghastly apparition of atheism. Well, Cardinal O'Connell's judgment was rather typical of some segments of the clergy. So I want to look briefly at the severe unease felt by two other theologians who, if I may say so, responded to relativity from a more sophisticated base. The first of these is one of the most intellectually engaged, widely admired person in his field in the 20th century, the theologian Paul Tillich. In 1933, he was summarily dismissed from his position at the University of Frankfurt, and he became an exile in the United States. And for many years, he was a colleague of mine at Harvard University. He was a spellbinding teacher, an extraordinarily productive writer. In 1928, he had met Einstein. He had heard him lecture. He became interested in the same question that had puzzled the Archbishop of Canterbury, namely, what consequence Einstein's idea and point of view has for religious thinking. Tillich's early position was, in fact, along the lines of Einstein's reply to the Archbishop. Tillich wrote in his book, Dynamics of Faith, as follows, quote, "Scientific truth and the truth of faith do not belong in the same dimension of meaning. Science has no right and no power to interfere with faith, and faith has no power to interfere with science. One dimension of meaning is not able to interfere with another dimension." So far, so good. But as time went on, Tillich became more and more alarmed by what he thought Einstein was saying and writing now. Because between 1930 and 1948, Einstein had published several widely discussed articles on religion and science, a project by which Einstein was inventing his own religion, which he called cosmic religion, just as he had invented his own science. In one of these essays, Einstein explained that the concept of a personal God was, to him, an anthropomorphic remnant of primitive times, of a religion of fear. This primal urge, he advised, has to be abandoned in favor of a Spinozistic feeling of awe and sense of wonder at the rationality and beauty of the universe. Moreover, Einstein, as a believer in strict causality throughout the universe, very much like Newton's physics, Einstein said he could not entertain for a moment, quote, "the idea of a being which interferes in the course of events, such as causing prayers to be answered and miracles to occur." Einstein concluded, "Serious scientific workers are the only profoundly religious people." Well, by 1940, Paul Tillich had enough of that. While he did not mention relativity theory explicitly, Tillich thought, like the two cardinals that I mentioned before, that Einstein's ideas, especially because of his worldwide fame, might constitute a challenge to a key doctrine at the base of the authority of religion. Thus, Tillich issued a manifesto in 1940 entitled "Science and Theology, a Discussion with Einstein." His sharp attack ended with a statement, "As the philosopher Schelling had said, only a person can heal a person. This is the reason that the symbol of the personal God is indispensable for a living religion," unquote. And so much for Einstein's cosmic religion. But Tillich sensed also that behind it all, there loomed not just a powerful viewpoint, but indeed relativity theory itself, and that had to be dealt with also. So toward the end of his life, Tillich wrote a set of essays in a book with the title "My Search for Absolutes." There he closed in what was to him the most dangerous enemy. Tillich was writing, as he put it, out of a feeling of uneasiness about the victories of relativity in all realms of thought and life. It threatens to overwhelm us. What Tillich called the great spectacle of scientific relativism was now, in his view, invading contemporary philosophy, ethics, and most vexing of all, religion itself. And against all of this, Tillich stood up for absolutes. Absolutes, he said, make language possible, understanding possible, truth possible. They are at the bottom of the moral imperative. Indeed, he said, the experience of the absolute is the experience of the holy, of the sacred. In 1950, there appeared a book important for our story, although it has been rather neglected so far. The author of the book was Philipp Frank, an important physicist and philosopher, successor to Einstein in Prague in 1912, and later his close friend who published an excellent biography on Einstein. The book of 1950 by Frank had the challenging title, Relativity, the Richer Truth. Well, Frank certainly knew about relativity. Early in his career, when still in Vienna, after getting his doctorate as student of Ernst Mach and Ludwig Boltzmann, Frank wrote some of the earliest publications explaining relativity to physicists. Always interested also in philosophical, historical, and sociological contexts of science, he was a prominent member of the Vienna Circle of Logical Empiricists. Well, now, let's look at his book. From its first paragraph on, he distinguishes between two opposites. On the one hand, there is relativism, which he defined as a common form of thought frequently regarded as an effect of allegedly exaggerated role of science in modern thinking. And on the other hand, there is fundamentalism, or the belief in absolute values. He then made the important distinction between relativism in science, which he celebrated, and which after all gave us relativity theory, and on the other side, relativism outside science, which he called a largely illegitimate translation of concepts from science to ethics or social beliefs. The whole short but fervently written book argues there's only one legitimate transfer from relativistic science to the other parts of culture and life. In science, one learns that a statement of the sort, "This table is 2 feet long," is a very poor way of describing things because it does not tell about the reference system. We need a richer language, one that contains statements of the type, this table is 2 feet long relative to the coordinate system of this room, and not with respect to some other moving coordinate system in which the length measurement would be quite different. This statement, again, is an objective truth, said he, and in the same way, Frank continued, a man who declines to answer by a flat yes or no the question, do you believe in God, should not be called a skeptic, a relativist, or agnostic, because the question itself, does a person believe in God, depends on what kind of life this person leads, to distinguish between the effective part of his religion from the verbal part. Similarly, terms such as freedom, democracy, and the like make sense only in terms of their operational meaning, just as the length of a table depends on the specification of the reference system within which the length is measured. In short, Frank's book was yet another attempt to persuade by skeptical rationalism and empiricism the opponents who preferred absolutism and revelation. Well, Frank's book is very lovely, but there's something unusual about it. It has a foreword by Albert Einstein. And Einstein's title of his foreword is nothing less than The Laws of Science and the Laws of Ethics. Science itself, Einstein reports, has properly nothing to say about values, purpose, emotion, and the like. It cannot produce ethical directives. However, he continues, there are two ways in which science is related to ethics. One way is that the habit of logical thinking and the search for empirical facts are important and useful both in science and in all other fields. Frank's book, of course, was largely devoted to that point. But the second relationship, Einstein continued, between science and ethics is that the mechanism by which true and useful results may be obtained is the same both in science and in ethics. That is, in both fields, one should start with fundamental premises or propositions, and from these, other propositions can be derived by logic, both in physics and in ethics. In fact, in his foreword, Einstein was transferring to ethics his own favorite method of theory construction in science. In his own work, Einstein had jumped at the very start of relativity theory to two principles or axioms of relativity, that of generalizing Galilean relativity to all of physics, and that of the constancy of light postulates, and deriving almost everything from that. Now, for ethics, in this foreword by Einstein in Frank's book, Einstein advised the same method for finding answers to ethical problems. That is, by setting up first ethical axioms and then deducing their consequences. But of course, there is a difficulty. So Einstein asks, what is the origins of such ethical axioms? For from a logical point of view, all axioms are arbitrary, and there are an infinity of them that you could think of. How to choose the right axioms at the beginning in ethics? Here Einstein continues happily. There do exist inspired individuals who can do it. These individuals can be the source of a set of comprehensive and well-founded ethical axioms. And Einstein names three such inspired individuals elsewhere: Moses, Jesus, and Buddha. They are all the same to him. But far from granting them the unquestionable inspiration by divine revelation and by the absolute sacralization of their writings, as religious fundamentalists would desire, Einstein, in the last two sentences of his foreword, subjects the supposedly inspired ethical axiom to tests for their actual effectiveness in practice. And he writes, quote, "Ethical axioms are found and tested not very differently from the axioms of science, because truth is what stands the test of experience." So in Einstein's opinion, ethical axioms, far from being true and infallible because announcing them, they can change, they can be cast aside when investigation requires, just as in the case of science. It is a key point for Einstein, and all the conciliatory skills of Philipp Frank's book, which he shows in the rest of the book, do not undo Einstein's operationalist test of ethics. Let us take a moment to look at the definition of relativism. Since the early 20th century, relativism, more often than not, was held to be a point of view fostered by relativity theory, both in science and outside. But the word which came into the English language in the mid-19th century connotes a much older point of view, as we shall see. The Oxford English Dictionary puts it this way: in relativism, knowledge is only of relationships. Therefore, truth, morality, etc. are said to be relative to situations. They are not absolute. Thus, meanings can fluctuate from place to place, from time to time. At the extreme, some non-scientific postmodernists even hold that all beliefs are equally valid, that they are only socially constructed. But even this skepticism and openness to change when necessary, as traditionally built into scientific research and typified by Einstein, is of course anathema to those who believe in the fixity and absoluteness of doctrines, in their infallibility, in the priority of revelation over rationalization, in the general inaccessibility of external opinion from any other authority. This dispute over the different claims of authority have come to a head quite recently in Rome. According to the official Vatican transcript, on Monday, the 18th of April 2005, while delivering a homily in the Vatican Basilica in St. Peter's, His Eminence Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Dean of the College of Cardinals, and for 23 years, Prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, the Eminence Cardinal Ratzinger quoted St. Paul's warning not to allow oneself to be tossed here and there, to be carried about by every wind. Examples the Cardinal gave of such tossings in the recent decades included being flung from one extreme to another, from Marxism to liberalism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to vague religious mysticism, and so forth. But the Cardinal then concluded the list with the one example which he evidently held to be the most dangerous. In his words as follows, quote, "Relativism is the only attitude that is now believed to cope with modern times." And he continued, "There has been building up a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definite." Now, these words became notable the world around when the following day, indeed a few hours later, the College of Cardinals elected Cardinal Ratzinger to be the new Pope, and hence the shepherd to over 1 billion of his faithful. Those who had studied his writings and speeches were already familiar with his point of view. For example, his biographer John Allen has written, "The Cardinal had long held that the Church's service to society is to stand for absolute truth that functions as a boundary marker because outside lies disaster." To be sure, some of the Cardinal's ideas had already been announced by Pope John II, for example, in his 10th encyclical of 1993, Veritatis Splendor, which showed John Paul II's concern with cultural relativism and relativistic ethics. Now I turn to typical reactions among recent and current philosophers who also participated in debates about relativism. Leaving aside non-philosophers such as Lenin, who wrote in 1908 in Materialism and Imperial Criticism his attack on relativity because he thought it was just Kantian idealism, and leaving also aside Oswald Spengler, who wrote in 1918 that relativity it will be part of the death of Western culture. Let me tell briefly to a few recent and contemporary philosophers. My colleague Hilary Putnam, in his book Reason, Truth and History, attacked a number of his fellow scholars to be relativists, including Richard Rorty and Paul Feyerabend. Rorty responded in his book Objectivity, Relativism and Truth by dismissing the unacceptability of relativism in the following contorted passage. He started by saying, "Evidence is not really a very useful notion, particularly when trying to decide what one thinks of the world as a whole, because there are many different kinds of rationality." On the other hand, Paul Feyerabend openly flaunted his relativism, famously in his book Against Method, where he applied it to science itself. And there he wrote that there is no such thing as scientific method, a conclusion which has political implications. One of them is that the activities of scientists should be subjected, he said, to what he called democratic relativism, which means, in his case, that lay people and democratic councils should evaluate the work of scientists. This is, of course, close to what is now happening, unfortunately, in the United States, where Congress and the administration are trying either to censure or dismiss findings of scientists on such matters as climate change. Feyerabend wrote in the same vein that the belief in rationality may be nothing but a pious wish. And he admits that many thinkers believe such a result to be intolerable. Relativism, they believe, says he, opens the door to chaos and arbitrariness. but he says these fears are groundless. One could spend days and weeks among the many books which deal positively and negatively with relativism. I shall just mention two serious ones. One is Joseph Runzo. The book is titled Reason, Relativism, and God. It systematically points out scholars which he regards as relativists, such as the anthropologist Ruth Benedict, the sociologist Walter Berger, the psychologist Jean Piaget, and of course Thomas Kuhn, the inventor of the succession of revolutions in science, each revolution appearing equally plausible and separated from previous and next ones by a barrier of incommensurability. But the favorite among all these books to me is that by an art historian, E.H. Gombrich, titled Topics of Our Time, in which Gombrich begins by reminding his readers of Goethe's belief in the universality of human nature, and he contrasts it with Hegel's philosophy of history. On Hegel, Gombrich says, right at the beginning, Hegel formulates the opposite view, which I should briefly characterize as cultural relativism. And Gombrich quotes Hegel as follows: every age has such peculiar circumstances, such individual conditions, that it must be interpreted only by reference to itself. Nothing is more shallow in this respect than the frequent appeal to Greek and Roman examples, which so often occurred among the French at the time of their revolution. Nothing could be more different than the nature of these people and the nature of our time. Gombrich could have gone further back than Hegel to discover the ancient roots of relativism. Many scholars point to the implicit debate between Protagoras, the sophist philosopher of 5th century ancient Greece, and Plato. As one author puts it in his book, Plato's Revolt Against Relativism, Plato, especially in his dialogue Phaedo, tried to identify what remains unchanged, universal, absolute, and constant, despite all appearance of diversity, all becoming and change, birth and decay. And that universal absolute to Plato was the immortality of the reincarnated soul. On the other hand, perhaps the earliest expression of relativism in philosophy is the famous dictum of Protagoras that man is the measure of all things, which to Plato was equivalent to relativism of truth and of judgment. And unlike philosophers, historians tend to put the beginning of relativism in history on the shoulders of Herodotus, also of the 5th century BC. Herodotus still reports myths and beliefs with relish, but it gives for the first time a desacralization sort of history. The gods are still meddling with mankind, but Herodotus avoids talking about that. He does not want to fall into the trap of the supernatural, he says. He rather is interested in the variety of human behavior. He delights in information such as this. Among Lydians, for example, a person to be seen naked is an occasion of great shame, but not so in Greece. In short, as one of his commentators put it, Herodotus wrote a kind of universal history. It is the record of all the logical possibilities, political, human, that can coexist in the human world. Nothing absolute there. Let me now finish. Having reached back to 15th century Greece in our search for defenders and opponents of relativity and relativism, let me return to Einstein's visit to Spain in 1923. While he was in Spain, and continuing after he left, there was, of course, a good deal of discussion of his work and his influence. In addition to the delighted audiences of his lectures, most of all the mathematically trained engineers, there were admiring clerics such as Luis Urbano, Benjamin Navarro, and especially the Jesuit mathematician Enrique Rafael, the last writing in the influential Jesuit journal, Raison y Fe, that it was wrong for Catholics to be anti-relativist because relativity was irrelevant to theology. A second group of Spanish intellectuals standing by Einstein were philosophers such as Manuel García Morente, Miguel de Unamuno, and José Ortega y Gasset, who has been mentioned. Ortega was the first to write an essay on the historical significance of relativity in Spain, which included a reply to the allegation of some anti-relativists. Einsteinian physics is indeed absolute, he said, because it held that physical laws are true, whatever the system of reference. And he concluded, in Einstein's physics, our knowledge is absolute. It is reality that is relative. And I cannot end this account with referring to the second curious but telling incident which took place when Einstein first visited Barcelona in 1923. Among the many things known about Einstein was his appeal to the working classes, as much as to intellectuals or even to royalty. Thus, on the 27th of February 1923, just a few days after he had arrived in Barcelona, a syndicalist delegation called on Einstein at the Ritz Hotel and took him to the union headquarters. What happened there? Two things stand out. One is fairly certain. Einstein was told by the unionists about their problems, to which Einstein is reported to have said, those problems are more due to other people's stupidity rather than evil, and that it might be helpful to everyone to read the works of Spinoza, which he described to the unionists as a source of many good ideas and timely advice. The other happenings there is much debated, circulated worldwide, appeared in the London Times, etc. One of the leaders of the syndicalists, Ángel Pestaña, maintained that Einstein had said at that meeting that he was a revolutionary. The newspapers extrapolated that to mean Einstein's scientific revolution gave support to the idea of economic revolution, since in their view, the law of relativity is without doubt the harbinger of moral relativity, the very point which so frightened all the cardinals. It made, of course, no difference to anyone that Einstein denied ever having uttered such a word, such a phrase, or, as he added, as he did often, that he did not believe in revolutions, either in science or in society. Ladies and gentlemen, this important fight in our culture between the claims of relativism on one hand and absolutism on the other, that has not gone away, as we have seen. It has gone on for 2,500 years. It will never end. Einstein found himself entangled in this fight late, and the uses and abuses made of his real or implied ideas have become part of our intellectual history. But happily, what is not in question is the glory of his work, of his paper on relativity, which he wrote just 100 years ago, and which we have been celebrating here and around the world. Thank you very much.